Али, микрофон есть. Уже слышно хорошо, да, мы вас ждем. Извините за неудобство.
Okay, shall I start now? Okay, here goes. Good morning, as it is here in California. I have been working on the Ingush language for 45 years, and I'm glad to have a chance to address this symposium. Europeans can trace their languages back very far in time, as long ago as 3,400 years to Mycenaean Greek, 2,000 years to Latin and the Roman Empire, and Aquitanian, and so on and so forth, all across Europe. Plus there is architecture from ancient times, inscriptions, archaeology, early historical records, early literature, such as the works of Homer. Also all of the language families represented in Europe can be traced back very far. The Indo-European family, ancestral to English, Swedish, French, Croatian, and many others, arose about 6,500 years ago, either near Kiev or near Kazan. The Semitic family, ancestral to Maltese, arose about 6,000 years ago in the Near East. The Uralic family, ancestral to Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, and many more, is about 4,500 years old from Western Siberian originally. But what about the Caucasus? What can we say along those lines about Ingushetia? I bring the point up because it's an important point of national identity and ethnic identity for Europeans to trace their ancestors back, or to be able to trace their language back if they wish to. For Ingushetia, we have an excellent archaeological record preserved in the soil and on the ground, but not much studied. Dictionaries and grammars for many languages, including Ingush, but not all. Words that have gone to and from between languages, telling us who has been in contact with who else, when. We have some description of ethnography, culture, and so forth. Ingush people know a lot about the origins of their clans and some of the early history of their clans. So a lot is known, but this is only a start. So I'm going to report on what we do know now about the ancient history of Ingush and its language family, and what more we need to know. I will do this by using historical linguistics and linguistic geography to shed light on Ingush prehistory, and find the earliest starting points for modern identity. So here are some things we do know about the origin of Ingush. We know about the language families that it's related to, and the family tree, and about how old that family is. We know a lot about the archaeology of the Caucasus, but by no means everything. And we can figure out the origins of some of the Nakh Dagestanian languages, including the Nakh branch. Here is an overview of the Caucasus. The Nakh Dagestanian language family is spoken over the eastern part, and Ingush approximately here. Important things are the mountain range, of course, connections between the ancient Near East and the ancient steppe. Those connections were very important, but how were they made over the mountains? That's part of my concern here. Here is the family tree for the Ingush language down here, and its close relatives, Chechen and Batsbi, and its more distant relatives, all of which make up a family that is probably about 6,000 years old. with 30 or more languages in that family. And here is how far we can trace the likely origin of that family back to before the actual family itself is likely to have arisen from one ancestor. In Mesolithic times, that is before there was any agriculture, before animal domestication, so hunting cultures, we have what's known as the Choch culture, named for the town of Choch in what is now Avar-speaking Dagestan. This is one of the first places where domesticated plants and animals appear archaeologically. So we can trace agriculture in Europe back to the town of Choch about 8,000 years ago or more. Here's an important Bronze Age archaeological site, modern-day Valikent. And here is a very important spot, Derbent, another town, where if you look closely at the shape of the map, these are the mountains. Over here there is a coastal plain. It gets very narrow. The mountains come down to almost to the ocean at Derbent, and then widens out again. And that coastal plain is the main connection between the steppe cultures of the north and the ancient Near East to the south. Here are two of the important early agricultural cultures and Bronze Age cultures. The Maikop culture, here's the Caucasus. The Maikop culture in the west, extremely wealthy, trading in metals, and the Kura Araxes culture in the south and east, including a lot of Nakh Dagestanian territory and Ingush territory. These are both Bronze Age cultures. They both covered a great deal of land. This is the Kura Araxes culture is much larger than the possible range of any one language or even language family in ancient times. So probably many languages were spoken here. Exactly how many, we don't know, but it's quite likely that ancestral Nakh Dagestanian was spoken around in here somewhere. But where and how? And that's about all we know. Was that Kura Araxes culture, again, the yellow part here, ancestral to modern Nakh Dagestanian and to Ingush? Was the Choch culture the ancestor? This is not quite the right way to put the question. There's certainly a question, but if you recall the map showing Choch, it's in the Avar-speaking highlands. In mountains, languages move uphill as mountaineers learn to speak the lowland language because that's where the markets are and the winter employment. And they gradually are inclined to shift over to everyday use of the lowland language. But Choch was already an uphill language, and it's a dialect of Avar, so it's due to the recent spread of Avar. We can't say Choch is ancestral linguistically to the modern languages. Here is a map of the languages of the Caucasus, including Kartvelian, ancestral to Georgian, the West Caucasian languages, Circassian and Kabardian, and the Nakh Dagestanian languages over here in a variety of different cultures. Here's Chechen and Ingush. Here is Batsbi, a distant relative of those. And here are the even more distantly related languages, Lezgi, Avar, the Dargi languages, and others. So we have to figure out how to get from all of these to one ancestor and account for the modern day Nakh languages. Here is what we can say about the origins of some of the branches of that family tree. The Nakh languages seem to have originally been spoken on the south slope, the south side of the Caucasus, and to have spread into the mountains from there. The Avar language and its relatives started out on the lower Sulak and spread uphill. This much is clear. They spread far uphill. The Lesgian branch spread uphill along the Samur and eventually populated a lot of the East Caucasus. And here again is Chokh, far uphill from any of these beginnings. But if we just look at this map, here's Nakh, here's one branch, here's another branch, so 3 branches of the family. Their starting points are very far apart. How do we get from those starting points to one starting point for the whole family at one point? That's the big puzzle here, and that's what is debated by linguists and archaeologists. Again, look at the map. Here's the mountain range, pretty much blocking access between the important cultures of the steppe and Europe to the north, up here and farther north, and the ancient Near East, where very many innovations arose. How did ideas, people, domesticated animals and plants and so forth move across the mountains? The answer is they didn't. It was not worthwhile to cross the mountains in the Central Pass. It was not really possible for a caravan, for instance, to go along the Black Sea coast in the west because there's no coastal plain. It's mountains going all the way down to the ocean, to the sea. In the east here, there is a narrow coastal plain. That is this green part. And that was the route of transport. This has been established archaeologically. Connections between the ancient Near East and the steppe in Europe went along here somehow. That is fine, but importantly, here is the location of Derbent, where the coastal plain becomes very narrow. It's blocked off by high rocky cliffs, and it's hard to get there. It's possible, but it's a challenge. My point is this narrow point, this constriction point, was very important for the prehistory of the Nakh Dagestanian languages and their speakers. Specifically, here's the narrow point. Here is how I envision the homeland of the Nakh Dagestanian family. Not a single point, but a long line of occupation and control. Whoever occupied this land was in a position to see their language spread beyond because they were important, and they controlled that narrow pass. So you can think of your linguistic and cultural ancestors as staffing the taxation point, enforcing law and order, and collecting taxes from every caravan and every rider and whatever foot person, pedestrian, traveling between north and south. And once again, there were many such because that communication was important and that economic connection was very important. So your linguistic ancestors were important managers of the trade between north and south. I'm going to use one point of grammatical structure, one small point about English grammatical structure to support that analysis. This is what I call autogender. We all know what the category of gender is in a language like Ingush. It's the agreement of verbs and some adjectives with every noun. So it's wash, wo, yish, ye, jali, de, whatever, wut, b, and so forth. Ye, de, b, wo. Those words agree in gender with the noun. The noun does not show its gender, you just have to learn it. And I assure you this is not easy, but it's possible, it's done. It's done easily by babies and with difficulty by adults, but it can be done. Okay, here is a list of words in Ingush and some of its sister languages, which all belong to the B gender. And in Ingush they are, this is my transcription, malf-b, but-b, arg-b, hak-b, nit-b, muz-b, ka-b, they're all b gender. Likewise, all of the cognate words in other languages belong to that same B gender, though the verb forms are different and the noun forms are different. But these all descend, each set of words descends from the same ancestral word in Proto-Nakh Dagestanian. I've underlined the B that many of these words begin with, which is curious. That is, a word like but and barg begin with the letter B in Ingush, the same as their gender marker, though in general you cannot judge the gender of a noun from its sound. If not a B, they start with an M, which is the closely related nasal sound. And where there's an M in Ingush, there is a B in a var here, and vice versa here. So this is not a normal sound correspondence. Something interesting was going on. There are also words in here which belong to B gender, but do not have either a B or an M at the beginning. Here's a Lesgi word, rach, which has no B or M, and a Hinalug word, and so forth. And finally, here's the word for ram, which does not have a B or an M in any of the languages, but nonetheless belongs to the same B gender class. That's a curious thing. If you think about languages like German, French, Russian, they do not start with a consonant that marks their gender. And in general, you cannot tell the gender from the sound of a word. Okay, so this applies to basic nouns and a minority of them, and especially to B gender, and it's the first consonant. And notice that sometimes that first consonant sets up a sequence of two consonants, which is otherwise very unusual in this whole language family. So the word for flea is psik in Batsbi, with a p at the beginning. The cognate in Ingush and Chechen does not have the p, so Ingush sagal is flea. The word for wool is th, beginning with a t, which goes back to a d, but the same word in other Nakh Dagestanian languages does not always begin with a D, though that's its gender. So it's curious. I did a survey of 50 nouns across all of Nakh Dagestanian to see which of those nouns do and which do not have autogender. And here are the results. 79%, or the large majority in Nakh, less and less, and find on some of the languages, and finally in the Dargwa language and Hinalug, very few, less than 50%. These languages run from west to east on both sides of the Caucasus. Nakh, originally in the south, Avar and Andic in the north, but both at the west, and so forth. It's an interesting distribution geographically. But again, the percentages of those 50 words I surveyed vary a lot.
Is die toehoren, ja.
Sorry? Okay. Shall I continue? Okay. Here's a graph showing the same things. Blue dots are languages with their numbers of autogender nouns. And you can see they go, here's Western and here's Eastern. The frequency descends from west to east. So what can we say about autogender? It goes back to the ancestral language, but word by word, it clusters up in branches, and the east-west distribution follows modern geography. So 3 stages are reflected: the ancestor language, the major branches and their later ancestors, and the modern geography. This I'm going to skip over. It's a graph saying the same things about the family structure. And all of this fits into the larger history of the language family, which has to do with ties to the land and control of the land. The family, the ancestor language, spread out precisely because its speakers controlled that narrow pass on the east-west path between steppe and ancient Near East. Its speakers used the land to their own economic advantage. They managed the trade routes. They, of course, had annual migrations uphill and downhill, as the traditional economy still does, and languages have spread from downhill to uphill for the last several thousand years. The Nakh branch separated early and spread separately in the south. Languages spread out partly because people moved, but mainly because highlanders found it useful to speak the lowland language. And the archaeology tells us that towns and villages are very old. Recall that map showing the Avar-speaking town of Chokh in the Dagestanian highlands. That town is something like 9,000 years old, but the Avar language came there recently, perhaps only since the Avar conquest of the eastern Caucasus. So what can we say about modern Ingush identity? The modern Ingush people can identify with places and land, and with people who made good economic use of that land. They made decisions about what language to speak. That now is Ingush, which has been, or the ancestor of Ingush, has been spoken in the area for a long time by the ancestors of the Ingush people. But their genetic connection, their archaeological connection, goes back at least as long as the language and perhaps earlier. So the identity is ancient, fairly well established, though we still need a lot of archaeological and linguistic research to be done. Thank you for your attention.